joints and articulations. And types of movements, I'll leave this down in case I need that. Types of movements are important because some of the joints, the types of movements that can occur dictates what type of joint it is. And the first thing I want to do as a type of movement is flexion extension. Anytime you close the angle between two bones, that's a flexion. So that's flexion. And then extension is when you open the angle between two bones. That's extension. So biceps curls is flexions and tricep pushdowns or whatever you call them. I haven't been a gym rat in a long time. They're extensions. So you have flexion and extension. Now I want to talk about two special flexions and extensions in a second. Here's something you might not realize. If my arm is out straight like this, and I bring it in, what kind of movement is that? Like this. What kind of movement is this? What is it? Flexion. This is flexion. This is humeral ulnar flexion. This is humeral radial flexion. You got to think about the joint where the action's occurring. All right, so this is flexion. Butterflies, or whatever you call them, that's a humeral ulnar flexion. This is a humeral radial flexion. Okay, so what's this right here? That's flexion. That's acetabulo-femoral flexion. This is acetabulo-femoral extension. Now, what about tibial-femoral? This is tibial-femoral flexion. This is tibial-femoral extension. So flexion, extension. Now do the hip joint, acetabulo-femoral joint. Flexion, extension. So you got to think about the joint when you're talking about the movement. Plantar flexion versus dorsiflexion. Plantar flexion is when you stand on your tippy toes. Plantar flexion is pushing your foot down. Plantar flexion is doing a toe raise. That's plantar flexion. Dorsiflexion is pulling your foot back. Some of the muscles that do dorsiflexion are called extensors. Here's why. Unfortunately, our feet are not like our hands. I would love to have an opposable big toe. I mean, think about it. You got an opposable big toe, you're sitting on your couch, and you want to grab the flicker, and you got your kid in your hand or whatever, put your beer in your foot, because your foot can grab it now. You grab the flicker. Now you're changing the TV channel, and you got your beer held in your foot. You know what else would be cool? If you had a prehensile tail. Then you could hand the beer to your tail, and you could drink with your tail. I mean, I wish I had a prehensile tail, too. But unfortunately, I do. I would take those in a heartbeat. Unfortunately, our feet aren't like our hands. So with our hands, this is flexion, and this is extension. With our feet, this is plantar flexion, and this is dorsiflexion. But dorsiflexion is really extension. If this was my foot and I went like that, that's the same as my hands going like that. So dorsiflexion is really extension. And a lot of the muscles that do dorsiflexion, like the extensor digitorum, they're called extensor muscles because dorsiflexion is really extension. It's kind of confusing at first, but you'll get it. So plantar flexion, toe raises, dorsiflexion, pulling your toes back towards your shin, towards your tibia.
Could you say that one more time?
Yep.
That's right, which is what?
Plantar flexion, doing a toe raise.
Right.
Dorsiflexion, pulling your toes back towards your tibia, your shin.
But then what's extension and flexion, just plain?
Okay, dorsiflexion is really extension.
Right.
Dorsiflexion is truly extension, but we call it dorsiflexion. That's what we call it. Plantar flexion is normal flexion. All right? Plantar flexion is going like, these are my hands. This is not plantar flexion. This is flexion of my metacarpals, right? That's flexion. See? Right. Flexion. Well, if these were my feet, flexion, toe raise. If you compared your hand, in the anatomical position, we supinate our hands. This is flexion. Therefore, this is flexion. Now, if these are my feet, plantar flexion is flexion. But dorsiflexion is extension. If these were my feet. See how the feet kind of screw you up? All right. Hyperextension. Some hyperextension is normal. Some hyperextension hurts you. Hyperextension is like this. Let me do the whole range of motion of my neck. This is flexion. Putting my mandible to my sternum is flexion. This is extension. This is hyperextension. You guys got that? Did you hear that in the video? That'd be cool if you hear that in the video. Anyway, flexion, extension, hyperextension. Now, obviously, this is flexion, this is extension, and if I hyperextend this, I hurt myself. Same with the knee. This is flexion, this is extension, and if I hyperextend my knee, I hurt myself. Some hyperextension leads to injuries, but with my neck, it didn't. Flexion, extension, hyperextension. All right. Abduction versus adduction. When you say abduction, think you abduct a child. You take the child away from their parents. You abduct them. So taking away from midline is abduction. So that's abduction. And then adduction is adding it to the midline. Adduction, A-D-D-duction. Adduction, abduction. So abduction and adduction, the way I remember it, is when you abduct a child, you take them away from their parents. When you abduct a bone, you move it away from the midline. Take it away from the midline. Medial versus lateral rotation. Well, if I'm like this, my humerus medially rotated. If I'm like this, my humerus laterally rotated. Let me show you right here. If I'm like this, my humerus medially rotated. Watch my humerus. My humerus, oh, it's not going to allow, the pins aren't going to allow me to laterally rotate. So this is lateral rotation of my humerus. This is medial rotation of my humerus. All right, you can do the same thing with your leg. If you can, now keep your ankle, when you're doing this with your femur, keep your ankle and your tibia, and don't just turn your ankle. That's another joint. Keep that stiff. You can medially rotate your femur. You can laterally rotate your femur. So I can medially rotate my femur, and I can laterally rotate my femur. Now I can't medially and laterally rotate my femur as much as my humerus because my glenohumeral joint, the glenoid fossa, is shallow, but my acetabulum's deep. It's harder to medially and laterally rotate my femur than it is unless you're one of those dancers that can do like put their chin back on their ankles or something like that. That's weird. Okay, abduction, medial, pronation versus supination. You guys know this. This is supination because you have to supinate to get into the anatomical position. This is pronation. So pronation and supination are typically reserved for just what the hands are doing. Supination, pronation. Supination, pronation. Obviously, you can't supinate your feet. We can't supinate our feet, or we probably would to go into the anatomical position. We can't, so we don't. Eversion versus inversion of the foot. Inversion is turning the foot in. Eversion is turning the foot out. So inversion, eversion. And excessive inversion, sprain your ankle. Excessive eversion, sprain your ankle. But you can normally invert and evert your foot prior to an injury, just you can't do it excessively. Elevation versus depression. So it's hard for me to talk when I do this, so I'll do it in the model first. Depression is opening the jaw. Elevation is closing the jaw. So this is depression. And then this is elevation. So raising the mandible is elevation. Lowering the mandible is depression. Now, that's it. I wish there was one more. Look what the jaw can do. The jaw can open and close. That seems like it's a hinge joint. We're going to talk about joints in a second. But the jaw can also do this. Push forward. You can also do this. Pull back. It can also protract and retract. Protract, retract. It can also do this. And that's called lateral excursion. Lateral excursion. The temporomandibular joint is a weird joint. It's a bicondylar joint. I'm going to show you condyloid joints here in a second. It's a bicondylar joint. And that's why it can do all those movements. Protraction, retraction, lateral excursion, depression, elevation. That's why the jaw can do all that. All right. Now, types of articulations right here. First of all, you have three main types of joints anatomically. No, I want to say that structurally. Structurally, you have three main types of joints. You have fibrous joints, you have cartilaginous joints, and you have synovial joints. This is a structural classification. Now, in addition, we have a different classification. It's a functional classification. And I'll put these words on the board. We have joints that can't move very much, or not at all, and they're called synarthrotic. We have joints that can move a little bit, and they're called amphiarthrotic. And we have joints that can move freely, and they're called diarthrotic. Thank you. Diarthrotic. Now, here's how that works. This is not a perfect rule of thumb. It's not perfect. But in general, my fibrous joints are synarthrotic. There are a couple of exceptions to that. In general, my cartilaginous joints are amphiarthrotic. And in general, my synovial joints are diarthrotic. Okay, now that's in general. Now guess what? You already know all of the sutures. That's a joint. You know the coronal suture, the sagittal suture, the squamosal suture, the lambdoidal suture. You know sutures. That's a fibrous joint. There's a sutural ligament in between those two bones. The syndesmosis is this distal tib-fib joint. This is a syndesmosis. There's a ligament in there holding these two things together. The best example of a syndesmosis is this distal tib-fib. There's a ligament there. And then a gomphosis is where the tooth goes into the jaw, or the tooth goes into the maxilla. So where your tooth goes into the mandible or your tooth goes into the maxilla, that's called a gomphosis. And there's a periodontal ligament there. Notice for all of these fibrous joints, I've said there's a ligament. There's a sutural ligament in our sutures. There's a ligament between these two bones, our distal tib-fib. And there's a periodontal ligament holding our tooth into our head. Those are fibrous joints. They have ligaments. Next, the cartilaginous joints. A synchondrosis. The best example of a synchondrosis is rib 1 to the sternum. That's the best example of a synchondrosis. The rest of these ribs to the sternum, by the way, are synovial joints. You're going to say there's cartilage right there. I know, but a synovial cavity forms around them. And rib 1 can't move when you go like this. When you go like that, rib 1 doesn't move. But the rest of your ribs do. They move when you make your chest cavity real big. What happens with rib 1, your lungs actually go like this. They move up. They move upward behind rib 1 and they go up like that. Rib 1 doesn't expand, but the rest of these ribs expand. So rib 1 to the sternum is a synchondrosis. All right, where do my papers go? Next, symphysis. This is the pubic symphysis, and that's the best example of a symphysis. I will tell you that in addition, these intervertebral discs are symphyses. They're both made of fibrocartilage. It's a symphysis. All right? Now we get to the synovial joints. All right. There's tons and tons of examples of all of, well, actually for the ball and socket joint, there's only 2 examples. But the rest of these have lots of examples. A gliding joint, they don't open or close any angle between bones. They slide past one another. The best example of gliding joints is your intercarpal joints. How your carpal bones slide past one another when you're moving, when you're going like this. These slide past one another. That's probably in your tarsals as well. When you're moving around, your tarsal bones slide past one another. And that's probably your best example. A saddle joint, the best example is your thumb. This is the best example right here. Your carpal, metacarpal, your carpal metacarpal 1. So right here. You probably could call that's the trapezium, by the way. Scaphoid, lunate, triquetrum, pisiform, trapezium, trapezoid, capitate, hamate. That's the trapezium. It's the trapezium to metacarpal 1. You probably could call that trapezial metacarpal joint. I've never heard it called that. You probably could. That's a saddle joint. You can see that makes a saddle. This is the reason why your thumb can oppose. That's called opposition. And this is called reposition. Opposition, reposition. The reason why your thumb can do that is because your carpal metacarpal joint of metacarpal 1 is a saddle joint. That's why that can do that. Oh, a hinge joint. You guys know a hinge joint. Elbow joint is a hinge joint. Your knee joint is actually a hinge joint. But you're going to say to me, you're going to say, Kickens, there's a little bit of play here. I can go sideways a little bit, not too much or it hurts. And in your knee joint, you can go laterally a little bit, but not too much or it hurts. You're right. There's a little bit of play there. But these are still hinge joints. They mainly move in just one plane. So knee joint, elbow joint are hinge joints. I guess the best hinge joints that don't have any play to them are your interphalangeal joints going like this. That's interphalangeal. Not that. That's metacarpal phalangeal. Your knuckles are metacarpal phalangeal, but interphalangeal are hinge joints. And there's no play there. If this flips to the side, you've just injured yourself. So those are hinge joints. The only pivot joint I know, oh, I actually know 2 of them. I wrote 2 of them down. There's 2 pivot joints. One is the atlantoaxial joint, the atlas on the axis. Saying no is a pivot joint. It is the atlas on the axis, and it's called the atlantoaxial joint, and it pivots around. The other pivot joint is when you pronate and supinate. Watch what the radius and ulna do proximally. Proximally, the radius just pivoted. Proximally, the radius just pivoted. This radial ulnar joint right here is a pivot joint. So those are 2 pivot joints. All right? And lastly, nope, not lastly, almost lastly, there's 2 ball and socket joints, glenohumeral, acetabulo-femoral. They're the only 2 joints that are ball and socket. Those are really easy. I usually ask those just to make sure that if you've paid any attention whatsoever, you get a point. Just because that's easy. Ball and socket, ball and socket. And then lastly, the condylar joint, also called an ellipsoidal joint. This is the hard one. Technically, the temporomandibular joint is a condyloid joint. It's really bicondylar, but we call it condyloid. By the way, some books call the TMJ a hinge joint. You guys know now it's not hinge. It doesn't only do this. It also does this. This. So you know it's not a true hinge joint. But this is a condyloid joint. Here's what else I wrote. That's a stupid one. Yeah, I like this one. The metacarpal phalangeal joint is, so my knuckles. These are condyloid joints. Now condyloid joints do more than one plane. They're biaxial. So this is one plane. Metacarpal phalangeal. But what about this? That's another plane. So these are condyloid joints. And they can do flexion and extension, and they can do abduction and adduction. Abduct, adduct, abduct, adduct. So that's a ellipsoidal or a condyloid joint. And the condyloid joint's really the hard one when you're looking at all these joints. So metacarpal phalangeal is a good one to talk about there. All right, now we have 3 specific joints you have to learn. The first one is the glenohumeral joint and all the ligaments of the glenohumeral joint. It is easy. Let's go down through and I'll show you. The acromioclavicular ligament. It better go from the acromion process to the clavicle or it doesn't make any sense. It does. That's the acromioclavicular ligament right there. From the acromion process to the clavicle. Acromioclavicular ligament. Next ligament is coracoacromial ligament. It better go from the coracoid process to the acromion process, and it does. Coracoacromial ligament right there. Goes from the coracoid process to the acromion process. Two coracoclavicular ligaments, they better go from the coracoid process to the clavicle, and they do, and here's one, and here's two. The first one is called the external coracoclavicular ligament because it's towards the outside. The second one's called the internal. Now, these have other names. Something I didn't tell you on the clavicle right here is this bump back here is called the conoid tubercle. And I didn't teach you that in the clavicle, and maybe I should add it in the future, because this ligament is also called the conoid ligament. That ligament right there, the internal coracoclavicular ligament is called the conoid ligament. Did I give that to you? Oh yeah, I did tell you that was called the conoid. And the external one is called the trapezoid ligament. So trapezoid and conoid, or external, internal, it doesn't matter how you say it. The next ligament is called the coracohumeral ligament. You're not going to like this. This is it right here. The reason you're not going to like that is because when you trace it back, you're going to say to me, wow, that's barely touching the coracoid process. It's more in the supraspinatus fossa. And I would not disagree with you, but it does touch the coracoid process a little bit. It does. If you trace this back and you follow it and you say, yeah, that touches the coracoid process a little bit. Part of it's in the supraspinatus fossa as well. All right, so that's the coracohumeral. The transverse scapular ligament's pretty darn easy. See the scapular notch right here? It's just the one that goes across the scapular notch. That's the transverse scapular ligament. It stays within the scapula. It goes from the coracoid process of the scapula to the superior border of the scapula. And that's just the transverse ligament, transverse scapular ligament. And then the last one, do I have one more? Yeah, the glenoid lip. If you look in here, I have nothing to point with. Yes, I do. I have this right here. If you look in here, right in here, and in there, I'll turn towards you guys in a second. There is a circular connective tissue surrounding the glenoid fossa. It helps to deepen the glenoid fossa. And this is called the glenoid lip or glenoid labrum. Labrum means lip. So it's right in here. It's circular around the glenoid fossa. You can look in different ways and see it, and that's called the glenoid labrum or glenoid lip. All right, let's do the knee joint.
Can we put it on the elbow?
Yes, want me to do that one again on elbow? You want me to do shoulder again on elbow?
Maybe later.
Yeah, no, I'll do it right now.
I just meant from here.
Yeah, I'll do it. I'll do the shoulder again on elbow. And I'll do the rest on elbow. So here you go. I'll go right in order again. The first one is the acromioclavicular ligament. Well, it has to go from the acromion process to the clavicle. This is the acromioclavicular ligament. The second one is the coracoacromial ligament. It has to go from the coracoid process to the acromion process. That's the coracoacromial ligament. Next one is the coracoclavicular ligaments. There's two of them, here and here. They go from the coracoid process to the clavicle. Coracoclavicular ligament, but that's the external, or called the trapezoid. Coracoclavicular ligament, that's the internal or conoid, and it does grab the conoid tubercle of the clavicle. Next one is the coracohumeral ligament. You're not going to like this one. This is the humerus. So this ligament goes to the humerus, and if you trace it, you can see it in here, and you can actually see it right there. It does go to the coracoid process, but it's also in the supraspinatus fossa. It's still the coracohumeral ligament. Coracohumeral ligament, coracohumeral ligament. You can trace it in there. The transverse scapular ligament is this ligament right here that just covers up that notch. The scapular notch is that ligament right there. And the last ligament is the glenoid labrum or glenoid lip. You've got to look right here is probably the best place to see it. Not for you guys, not really. You gotta look deep into here. There you go. It's right there. It surrounds, it makes a circle around the glenoid fossa, and it deepens the glenoid fossa in a way, and it's called the glenoid lip. All right, now the knee joint. So this is the knee joint right here. So first of all, this is the quadriceps tendon, this is the quadriceps ligament, this is the patella. And this comes out. So please move this out so you don't break anything. What we have here is this. If you open the knee from the front, you see this ligament right here called the anterior cruciate ligament. That's the anterior cruciate ligament right there. You guys able to see that? Anterior cruciate ligament. And then what we have is we have the posterior cruciate ligament. I can see it way back in here. The anterior and posterior cruciate ligaments actually kind of make an X. They cross each other. That's the posterior cruciate. But I can also turn this around and I can see the posterior cruciate right here. This is the posterior cruciate right here. This one has another name. I'll name it in a second. So that's the posterior cruciate, and that's the anterior cruciate. You're going to say, I can see the anterior cruciate from the back? Yeah, because they crisscross, they make an X. Okay, next is the fibular or lateral collateral ligament. Turn this back around. Remember your fibula's on the lateral side. Here's your tibia, here's your fibula. This is the lateral collateral ligament, and this is the medial collateral ligament. They have other names, however. This could also be called the fibular collateral ligament because it goes to the fibula. And this is called the tibial collateral ligament because it goes to the tibia. Quadriceps femoris tendon. This is the quadriceps femoris tendon right here. But then it inserts on the patella, and this is the quadriceps femoris ligament. Some people call this the patellar ligament. So you can call this patellar ligament if you will. Remember, ligaments go bone to bone. This ligament is going patella to tibia, bone to bone. Tendons go muscle to bone. This is the quadriceps femoris tendon because it's going from the quadriceps muscle to the patella. Okay? All right. Next is the transverse ligament. This is the transverse ligament right here. It connects my menisci. It connects my medial and lateral meniscus together. That's what it does. My transverse ligament. Connects my medial and lateral meniscus. The meniscofemoral ligament is right here. It goes from the meniscus, that's the lateral meniscus, and this is the femur. My meniscofemoral ligament goes from my lateral meniscus to my femur, and that's it right there. You're going to say to me, it runs right into the posterior cruciate. You're right. It fuses with the posterior cruciate. And then I have these two menisci. This is the medial meniscus and this is the lateral meniscus. Medial meniscus, lateral meniscus. You can also see them on the front. Lateral meniscus, medial meniscus. Okay, that's the knee bone, the knee joint. Now I will show you two things here. You have all of these keys. I want to show you something. Then I'll show you the foot. Notice on the medial side of my ankle, the names all start with tibio. Tibionavicular, tibiotalar, tibiocalcaneal, tibiotalar. On the medial side, they all start with tibio. On the lateral side, they start with the tarsal bone in which they originate. The tarsal bones are talus and calcaneus and navicular and cuboid and cuneiform, right? So on the lateral side, they start with the tarsal bone, and they end with fibular, all of them. Talofibular, calcaneal fibular, talofibular. All right? So look at this. Let's do the medial side first, and let's go right in order. Oh, lateral view first, because we're going to go right in order. A talofibular ligament better run from the talus to the better run from the talus to the fibula. And this one's the anterior talofibular ligament, and there it is right there. This is the anterior and this is the posterior. They both run from this talus right here to the fibula right here. I'm going to name those bones for you again. Calcaneus, talus, navicular, medial cuneiform, intermediate cuneiform, lateral cuneiform, cuboidal. So this is the anterior talofibular. This is the posterior talofibular. This is the calcaneal fibular. Goes from the calcaneus to the fibula. So those are those three. Where am I? Anterior we did, posterior we did. And then the long plantar ligament. Well, there's a plantar aponeurosis. See, this doesn't really show me the long plantar ligament. I'm just going to go with it. This is really called the plantar aponeurosis. Let's see what your key calls it. Your key, good. It doesn't label it. This is really the plantar aponeurosis, and right underneath it is a ligament called the long plantar ligament. We're just going to call this the long plantar ligament because they're really fused anyway. It doesn't really matter. So this is the long plantar ligament. Now, if you study with someone from Guga's class or something and they say, oh, that's really the plantar aponeurosis, they're right. The long plantar ligament is really in here and it's not even showing it, so we don't have to worry about it. Okay, now let's do the medial side. Here's the medial side, right in order. The calcaneonavicular ligament, it's called the spring ligament. It's right here. From the calcaneus to the navicular. The calcaneonavicular ligament. That's called